favorite tune. So, help me out a little bit here. He is able, more than able, to accomplish what concerns me today. He is able, more than able, to handle anything that comes my way. He is able, more than able, to do much more than I could ever dream. He is able, more than able, to make me what He wants me to be. After this song, we will have communion. And can it be that I should gain an interest in my Savior's blood? Died He for me, who caused His pain, for me who scorned His perfect love. Amazing love, how can it be that you, my God, would die for me? Amazing love, how can it be that you, my God, would die for me? You left your Father's throne above, so free and infinite your grace, emptied yourself of all but love, and bled for helpless race. Amazing love, how can it be that you, my God, would die for me? Amazing love, how can it be that you, my God, would die for me? Morning. Thank you all for the early birthday wishes. As I was thinking about what I wanted to share for communion, I don't know if you all remember, but the last time I was up here, I had both Juneteenth and Father's Day right at the same time. I told Jenny it was an embarrassment of riches for things to reference for a communion thought. And aside from my birthday, I don't have too much to anchor on for September 18th, so I kind of had to, I guess, kick it old school and just think about without a big prompt to start with. And so I ended up just going back to a classic communion verse. I don't know about all of you, but I grew up in a church where communion was pretty different from what we do here. in that it was a little bit more of kind of, I guess, a rote exercise in which we'd read one of 2 or 3 verses and kind of speak almost from a script to describe what communion was and why we did it. The benefit of that is anytime I sit and think about our communion reflections, I am kind of immediately drawn back to some of those scriptures. And there was one that stood out that I wanted to start with today. So 1 Corinthians 11:23, and I'm going to read through verse 25. For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me." So we have it right here on our table here. It's a little hard to pick up, partially because I'm standing in front of it, and even if I move, the podium's still blocking it. But that last bit about "in remembrance of me" was really the thing that kind of my thoughts ended up centered on. And it kind of broadened to the general idea of memory as I kind of sat with it. And memory is a powerful thing. For me, when I think about memory or in remembrance of me, I am often kind of connected back to my father. So 2 months from now will be the 10-year anniversary of his passing. And a few months before he died, he and I had a phone conversation that was actually all about remembrance. So I was a couple months into working my first and only job. I've only worked at one place. So I was out of college, and I'd actually gone to buy a professional wardrobe that actually fit me. So what you should all understand is that all of the dress clothes that I owned around this time 10 years ago were things that fit me when I was playing college football. And the thing about football players is that we have massive necks. So my neck was like 17 and a half inches. What that produces is a gigantic shirt that generally matches the neck size. But that was not the case for me. So, as Denise can attest, as my coworker at the time, I was walking around the office swimming in my dress shirts. And it seemed like, having collected a few paychecks, it was the time to go and address that issue. So anyway, my father had been an attorney for his entire career, wore a suit and tie to work every day, and had actually, like, over the course of my life, and we, at church, we wore suits to church every week. And so we'd spent a lot of time, and he'd kind of spent a lot of time imparting a lot of wisdom about kind of business and business casual dress, how to kind of spot what you should and shouldn't be wearing, things like that. So I'd gone and I'd kind of updated my wardrobe, and I was standing on a train platform downtown. I was living in the West Loop at the time, and I was just off of, I was on State Street, and I decided to call my dad because I don't know, I guess I'd basically done all of this type of shopping with him up to this point in my life, and so I decided to give him a call and tell him what I was up to. And so during the conversation, and this was completely true, I told him that really throughout my entire time in the store, like, I could just hear his voice. in my head the entire time, was, okay, so make sure you squeeze the fabric and see if it bounces back, because if it does, that's probably a sign of a better quality suit than something that remains wrinkled after you do that. Or, you're always going to want to go with 100% wool. It's an all-season fabric. So it was things like that, and I could hear him in my head while I was shopping. And so I told him that, and then he responded with something that was clear to me. He was no longer talking about clothes. He said, "Good. If you didn't hear me, then I didn't do my job." And in that moment, and this is it's a meaningful conversation, because it's honestly one of the last ones that I really clearly remember with him. When he was in the hospital, he was actually intubated for a while, and so he actually couldn't speak. And so this is like genuinely one of the last things I remember hearing him say. And it occurs to me that the memory of all the lessons that he taught me, whether they were about clothes or about far more important things in life, weren't just so that I could have some nice story to tell about shopping, or it wasn't just him trying to wax poetic about wool and polyester blends. It was about a memory that should spur action. A voice that I could hear guiding me to make the right choice. And to make that choice, or make those choices, in so many areas in life. So when I read 1 Corinthians 11, and I hear Jesus saying, "Do this in remembrance of me," I hear him saying that when you think about the sacrifice, hear my voice. Hear it guiding you. He's talking about more than just bread and wine. He's talking about that voice that he left with us. So as we take communion, the question that I would ask all of you, and the question that I will sit with as well, is what is that voice saying? Where is it guiding you? What choice is it encouraging you to make? Let's bow. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for memory, for the voice that you have left us to guide, to teach, the lessons that you and your Son desire for us to carry every day, to help us know which way to go, the many forks that we encounter in our lives. Lord, we thank you for the sacrifice that we commemorate to remember that voice, to remember its presence with us, speaking to us, guiding us. And Lord, I pray that you give us the strength and clarity and wisdom to listen, to hear that voice, and to heed that voice. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.
Good morning, everyone. I have a garbage can for 2 reasons. I've had a chronic runny nose my entire life. My nose runs at the worst possible times. That's 1 reason. And 2, I want you to use that to set your standards, our expectations. This might go in the round file. The title of this sermon is, I should say message. It makes this feel like less pressure when I say something other than sermon. The title of this message is God and Time. The goal of this message is, hopefully, to provide a simple and systematic way to answer the question, does God exist? As Christians, that question is very important for us to answer, to be able to answer, because if God does not exist, if the answer to the question is no, then we're wasting our time. The implications are far-reaching. But if the answer to that question is yes, then the implications for humanity as a whole, the implications are far-reaching. Because if God does exist, then the way that we define what a human being is connected to the answer to that question. If God does exist, then how we perceive reality, how we perceive or define the meaning of life, the meaning of death, how we view the course of world history, where it's headed, and what's going to happen to the universe, all of those things go back to the question, does God exist? When it comes to the question, does God exist, I want to try to answer that question in a 2-step process. The first step involves looking at the difference between the words non-existent and the word invisible. The 2 words have a very distinct difference, and we need to look at that before we go further. The word non-existent means that something is not real. It's invisible because it doesn't exist. And if something is non-existent, then it cannot affect physical realities. It cannot affect the visible physical world that we live in. It cannot affect us. Superman, Casper the Friendly Ghost, or as one of my favorite atheists likes to say, Richard Dawkins puts God in the category with the flying spaghetti monster. That is not a real thing. On the other hand, if something is invisible, it just means that it's not seen. A reality can be invisible, and at the same time, it can be very real. Air is an invisible reality, and that's the reason why we are all not falling on the floor right now, because we're breathing air. The wind is an unseen reality. It's invisible, but it can rip the roof of a church off completely and put it on the next block. It's very real, but it's invisible. Carbon monoxide is invisible. Another invisible reality is Wi-Fi. Yes, I don't have to say anything else. It's real. Another invisible reality is the God that we serve. People make fun of us. They ridicule us because we serve an invisible God. But there is something about our God that a lot of people fail to realize. Our God has literally shaped the world that we live in. If it was not for God, his ideas that originated in his mind and his outside intervention into human affairs, then the world that we know of right now, that we live in, it would be very, very different. Very different. It would be unrecognizable. God's fingerprints are on so many things that it's almost incomprehensible. So that's the difference between invisible and non-existent. Next, the next step in answering the question, does God exist, involves looking at 7 ways to reach the conclusion that God actually does exist. The first method involves studying atheists. There are 4 things that you want to look at when you look at atheists. You can see God's fingerprints on their lives. Christopher Hitchens was an atheist. James Randi was an atheist. Michael Shermer currently is. When you look at their names, they have the names that they have because of God, or God is part of the meaning of their name. The name Christopher Hitchens basically means, if you Google it, bearer of Christ. That is a Christian name. The name James is famous because it's biblical. There's a book called the Book of James, and if you look in Mark chapter 6, verse 3, you'll find that Jesus had a brother named James. The name Michael means gift of God, or who is greater than God? Who is like God? It's something like, it involves God. So he's done. The second thing that you want to look at when you look at atheists is, and this is my favorite one, a lot of people that are outspoken atheists in our times, a lot of them are actually Jewish. God has a sense of humor. He has. Christopher Hitchens, you can Google this. I was amazed. Christopher Hitchens, Stephen Fry, Steven Pinker, Lawrence Krauss, Bill Maher, Raymond Teller of Penn and Teller, and Bill Nye are Jewish. In God's mind, Bill Nye is not the science guy. Bill Nye is the Jewish guy. If you look in Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 2, God has said that the Jewish people were his chosen people. If you look at Genesis chapter 15, verse 5, and you look at Genesis chapter 26, verse 4, in 2 different places, God gave a prophecy to Abraham which predicted that Abraham's descendants will become very numerous. Some of his descendants are among us today, and some of them are atheists, which is like hard to reconcile. It's like, how can you say that God doesn't exist and you exist because of God? It's like, they're killing their own argument. Okay, this is the point where I have to wing this sermon because you didn't hear me screaming back there in panic, but God heard it because I realized that I left a page out of this outline, and I was like, "Ow!" Okay, here we go. We're winging it now. The third thing that you want to look at with atheists is, and you might have to look, you got to look this up on your own because I left my page at home. You want to look at what God did first in history, or you want to look at how God beat atheists to the punch. One example is Penn and Teller. They have a magic act, a routine that's called fishing coins. And in this act, Teller, the one that's Jewish, it appears as though he makes coins appear out of thin air, and then he puts the coins in a fish tank, he swirls his hands around, and then the coins turn to fish. Now, to me, that's remarkable because I can't reproduce that, and I can't tell you how he did that. But in God's mind, that's not remarkable. That's not even original, because Jesus did the original miracle with fish and coins. He used fish and a coin to pay his taxes and Peter's. God did it first. When you look at an atheist named Bertrand Russell, I guess he thought he was being clever or something when he said this quote that he's known for. He said, well, if God does exist, then I'll just say, well, I didn't have enough evidence. That's not going to work because God beat him to the punch. When you look at the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, towards the end of it, the rich man wanted someone to be sent to warn his brothers about this place of torment. He didn't want his brothers to go there, and the answer to his request was, they have the scriptures. They have more than enough evidence. So God beat Bertrand Russell to the point. Another thing that you want to look at with atheists is, where did they go to college? Where did they get their college degrees from? Michael Shermer is an outspoken atheist, but he attended Pepperdine University. yeah. Pepperdine is a Church of Christ college, and you can read about the churches of Christ in Romans chapter 16, verse 16. God's fingerprints are on his degree from Pepperdine University. Okay, so that's the first thing you want to look at. That's the first way that you can reach the conclusion that God does exist. Here's number two, simple logic. A lot of times atheists talk nonsense, but if you listen to them, they will lead you to conclude that God does actually exist. Stephen Fry has a video on YouTube, and the title is Stephen Fry on God. In his video, it has over 1 million views. He says some pretty mean things about God. One of the things that he says is that he says bad things about God because God allows children to be born blind. There are two things about that. First of all, Stephen Fry is Jewish, and he's not the first Jewish guy to ask that question, why would God allow someone to be born blind? In the New Testament, one of Jesus' disciples asked that question when they came across a blind man. So he wasn't the first one to ask that question. The second thing about that is, in order, allowing someone to be born blind is an action. Before you can perform an action, simple logic dictates that you first have to exist. So if he's saying that God allows this to happen, the logical conclusion is that God actually does exist. Their arguments are flawed and they have holes in them. That's the second way that you can reach the conclusion that God does exist. Number three, you can use time to reach the conclusion that God does exist because there are direct relationships between God and time. One of them I learned from Austin. I was in class one morning. Neil deGrasse Tyson is a scientist, brilliant guy, astrophysicist, yada, yada. He's real smart. He has a video on YouTube, and he defines time. But what he said was, basically, in the ancient world, time was only measured by lunar cycles or the moon, solar cycles or the sun, or seasons. His answer was kind of inaccurate, and God thinks that he needs to update or edit his video because in the ancient world, the Jewish people had festivals and celebrations that were based on cycles of 7 that were independent of anything that you found in nature or any cycle that you found in nature. That is very significant because it means that their idea came from outside of humanity. It came from God. The second relationship between God and time is, around the time that Jesus was born, there was a sense of expectancy. That sense of expectancy was based on a 70 weeks prophecy that God gave in the book of Daniel. That measurement of time that allowed the Jewish people to know when the Messiah was going to appear was based on a cycle of 7. There's another way in our modern world to see a relationship between God and time. During the course of a psychiatric evaluation, a psychiatric doctor might say, do you know the date? That question is very theological, it is very biblical, and it involves God because the calendars on our phones, on our electronic devices, the year is a measurement, and that measurement is based on the birth of Christ, and the birth of Christ was the fulfillment of a biblical prophecy. Actually more than one, but time will not allow. Okay, number 4. The fourth way. Sorry. Oh, okay. We just covered time, the relationship between God and time. According to people like Albert Einstein, time and space are connected. So let's look at places that are linked to God. One of the places that is linked to God is India. One of the arguments that atheists use is geographical location. They would say to us, oh, since you live in America, that's the reason that you're Christian. And if you live somewhere like India, then you would probably worship a blue elephant or something like that, Vishnu or whatever. That argument, it's a weak argument because if you look at world history and church history, the person that took the message of Christ or the gospel to India first was Thomas. He did that during the middle of the first century. If Christianity is not popular in India today, it's not because of God. God sent the news about Christ to India before he sent the book of Revelation to John on the island of Patmos. They got it. If they didn't accept it, that's not God's fault. Another place that's linked to God is Rome. In the city of Rome, there's a monument that's called the Ark of Titus. The images on it depict how the Roman general Titus conquered Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. Before that became a historical reality, Christ predicted it in a prophecy in the book of Luke. Another place that's linked to God is the White House in Washington, D.C. Our 44th president had a permanent suntan like me. The reason that he was able to become president historically is linked to God. In the book of Galatians, Paul talked about breaking down racial barriers between Jews and Gentiles, between slaves and free. That idea is an idea that God planted in the minds of humanity, and that idea has shaped the course of world history. Now, there are a lot of reasons that Obama made it into the White House. You know, we voted for him, the Electoral College, yada, yada. But God had his fingerprints on Obama's presidency. Of all places, Sin City is another place, Las Vegas, where you can see God's influence. I was going to say if you go to Caesar's Palace. I can't recommend that you go to Caesar's Palace. If you Google Caesar's Palace, don't go there. You'll see at least 5 works of art that can be linked to God. There's a huge statue of Augustus Caesar on Las Vegas Boulevard in front of Caesar's Palace. In the book of Luke, chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, you can read about how God used Augustus Caesar to get Mary and Joseph to go to Bethlehem, the place that God wanted Jesus to be born, so that a prophecy could be fulfilled. If you stand in front of Caesar's Palace in Sin City, at the intersection of Las Vegas Boulevard and Flamingo Road, you'll see 7 statues of 7 angels blowing 7 trumpets. That's found in the book of Revelation, chapter 8, verse 6. God, that idea for those statues came from God. In front of Caesar's Palace, you will see statues of winged lions. In the book of Daniel, chapter 7, verse 4, God used a winged lion to represent the nation of Babylon to Daniel. There's a statue of a Roman soldier on that property that has on the full armor of a Roman soldier. When God looks at that today, he thinks about the book of Ephesus, chapter 6, verses 10 through 18, where Paul spoke about the armor of God. There's a statue of David inside of Caesar's palace. In 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 14, God said that David was a man after God's own heart. Statues can't literally talk, but figuratively speaking, even statues in a place called Sin City are screaming to us that there is a God and that God does exist. The 5th thing that you want to look at is miracles. Bill Nye, the Jewish guy, he has a video on YouTube, and the title is, "Why Can't We Use Computers to Talk to Animals?" In his video, he claims that it is not possible. He's actually that video kind of takes a jab at Numbers chapter 22, verses 21 through 29, because God allowed an animal to speak to a man. He allowed them to converse. In God's mind, Bill Nye needs to update his video because scientists have taught a gorilla named Coco how to use sign language to communicate fluently with humans. So it took us many centuries, but we finally figured out, oh yeah, God was right. Well, I guess we can. If that's not a good enough example, then there's another video about a different ape that's called Kanzi. That's the ape's name. Kanzi used an electronic keyboard to communicate with other human beings. So Bill Nye needs to update his video. And those accomplishments by scientists help to confirm and concrete the idea that God was right. You know, it is possible. They demonstrated it. When you look at the book of Jonah, some people struggle with the idea that Jonah spent time inside of a big fish. On YouTube, there are two types of videos about humans being swallowed by whales. One involves one man being swallowed by a whale. The other video on YouTube, you can see a whale swallow two people that were in a kayak. That incident helps to confirm what God said about Jonah. And here's what makes the book of Jonah, what happened to him and the fish, here's what makes it believable. Human beings did not invent the timeout. God invented the timeout. Because if Jonah would have done what God told him to, and if he would have taken a land route to Nineveh, a big fish wouldn't have swallowed him on land, on dry land. Jonah was rebelling. He took a boat, went over the water trying to get to Nineveh. God caused Jonah to be swallowed, but it was Jonah's fault. And that's what makes the Bible very believable, because God doesn't just show you the best of us. He shows you, us when we're at our worst. The sixth way to reach the conclusion that God does exist involves science and technology. I would suggest that you watch a video on YouTube by a man named Bishop Robert Barron. He talks about the supposed conflict between science and Christianity or religion. There is no conflict. The current scientific world that we live in is based on findings and ideas that Christians had. Basically, Christians thought along the lines of, okay, God is not the author of confusion. God is orderly. He gives us commands and laws. The universe operates in a very orderly and predictable way. What are the laws that God has used that govern the universe? That one basic idea is the reason that we have the scientific age that we have. The scientific age that we live in, it did not start in China. It did not start in India. It did not start in Africa. It started in Europe because Christians were thinking in terms of, well, how does God run the universe? There's another thing about science and God. A lot of discoveries like the Big Bang, the idea that the sun doesn't rotate around the earth actually rotates around the sun. That discovery was made by a Christian named Galileo. There's another thing about technology. And it seems like I keep picking on Austin White. Austin White used to give me the flux. He used to drive me nuts because I would sit in his classes and like my view of the Bible is kind of like this big picture thing, like broad. He would take 4 or 5 verses and park. He would teach for 2 weeks. It's like he is pulling a rabbit out of a hat. And I would be sitting there looking like, how does he do that? Is that a miracle? How does he do that? Of all people, Jordan Peterson gave me the answer one day. I'm just flipping through YouTube. I don't know. It was mindless. I wasn't looking for this. And Jordan Peterson said that the Bible is the first hyperlinked document in history. I was like, what? I clicked that. He was right. And even, what is that guy? Tim Mackey uses the term hyperlinked when he refers to the Bible. Like when we use a computer, it might have like a little blue or like different color. You hit the link, it takes you somewhere else. That is what the Bible does thousands of times. Oh, I'm sorry for telling you a secret, but you can literally take a few verses and just go to different parts of the Bible. The Bible actually is hyperlinked. Austin White does that, and the book of Revelation is a classic example of that. You can't even unlock that book or read it without hyperlinking it to the other 65 books that come before it. You need those books to understand that book. So we have science and technology, God's influence on those things. The seventh and last thing is world religions and the Bible. One of the things that people say to us as Christians is, there are a lot of books on religion. How do you know that yours is different? There is a major difference between the Bible and all other books on religion in the world, on earth. All other books tell you how to find God. The Bible is about God's search for all of you. That is the difference. It's the opposite. God is looking for you. Second thing, the Bible can alter the course of world history, and it can change how wars turn out. If you look at the Christmas Day truce of World War I, Christmas Eve, people on the opposite lines of the battlefield, opposite sides of the battle line, were killing each other. And then on Christmas Day, they started singing Christmas carols. It was Christmas. There was a ceasefire. And they literally stopped fighting and did what Jesus told Peter to do: put down your sword. The Bible created peace in a time of war. That should be a lesson for humanity. One of the things that Dr. King said about World War II was that it was illegal to help a Jewish person in Hitler's Germany. But if he lived in Hitler's Germany, he thinks that he would have helped them. Why would he say something like that? It is because of the Good Samaritan. Help those that are not like you. Help those that might be from a different nation than you. Another thing about atheism, about the Bible and world religions in the Bible, is that it actually describes atheists. A lot of so-called atheists that are very vocal, they were actually Christians. And in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 1, it says that in the latter times, many will fall away from the faith. The Bible is actually describing atheists. There's another thing about the Bible and how it has affected the world that we live in. If you look at entertainment, you wouldn't have a series on Netflix called Lucifer if it were not for God. You would not have a movie called Devil's Advocate if it were not for God. You would not have a song by the Rolling Stones called Sympathy for the Devil if it was not for God. And here's something interesting about the devil, Satan, Lucifer. He's not an atheist. If you look in Job chapter 1 and 2, Satan is absolutely sure that God does exist. He spoke to God face to face. Even if you look in the New Testament, Satan requested, he made a request to God. He wanted to sift Peter. He wanted to test Peter and try and pull Peter away. There's another thing about Satan. Who does he try to pull us away from? Sermon over. Exactly. He's trying to pull us away from someone that he knows exists. Where am I? Okay, I'll wrap it up. Here's the takeaway. A lot of people think that we are fools for believing in an invisible God, but here's the reality of the situation. The world that we live in would not exist. It would be totally different if it was not for God's ideas that originated in his mind, and if it was not for his outside intervention into human affairs, if it was not for how he altered the course of world history, the world that as we know it would be unrecognizable to us. I'll get you in a minute, Lucy. And there's another thing about God. People think that the question, sometimes some people might think that the question, does God exist, is actually a difficult question to answer. It's not a difficult question to answer. It's a ridiculous question to answer. It's like, do human beings need air? Is the earth flat? God has shaped the world to the point that it's a ridiculous question to even ask. Normally, whoever does the sermon, they have the last word. But I want to do something a little different. I want to give all of you the last word. I'm going to ask a simple question, and when I put my hand to my ear, I want you to give me an answer, yes or no, and then that'll be the last word. You get the last word.
I want to ask you a question before you that I want to ask you, what is visible and invisible? God is visible and there's things invisible. Can you see the difference?
Yes, I can. Sometimes he does make himself visible, but my problem is he doesn't make himself visible to me, and I need to figure out for sure. We'll finish that after this. After I'm done, I'm 60 seconds from being done. Okay. No. I'll talk to you afterwards. Give me about 60 seconds. Okay. So here's the question. Does God exist?
Yes.
All right, let's stand and sing one last song. I want to know Christ and the power of his rising.